Deep in Russia's long-restricted Ural region, scientists have uncovered startling new evidence that challenges decades of official accounts about the 1957 Kyshtym disaster. Using advanced satellite imaging and soil analysis, researchers have detected hidden contamination and possible storage failures within the Mayak site. What they found beneath the forests may rewrite the history of nuclear secrecy forever. The hidden blast. On 29 September 1957, a catastrophic explosion shook the Mayak Production Association, one of the Soviet Union's most secret nuclear facilities. The accident occurred in a storage tank containing between 70 and 80 tons of liquid radioactive waste. A cooling system installed to prevent overheating had failed the previous year and was never repaired. As the contents of the tank heated, the liquid began to evaporate, leaving behind a dense mixture of nitrates and acetates. When this residue reached critical temperatures, a powerful chemical explosion erupted, comparable to the detonation of 70 to 100 tons of TNT. The blast hurled a massive concrete lid weighing about 160 tons into the air. The explosion released approximately 20 megacuries, equal to about 740 petabecquerels of radioactive materials. Around 90% of this release settled near the site, contaminating the immediate area and intensifying pollution in the Teka River system. The remaining fraction formed a radioactive cloud that drifted for many kilometers. This airborne plume, carrying roughly 2 megacuries of radionuclides, spread contamination across a vast swath of the southern Urals. The Mayak site had already been burdened by extensive radioactive waste disposal practices before the disaster. The Teka River had received nearly 2.75 megacuries of intentionally released waste, and Lake Karachay had absorbed an even greater burden, amounting to about 120 megacuries. The 1957 explosion transformed these already hazardous areas into zones of acute contamination, amplifying the long-term environmental and health consequences. Within 10 to 11 hours after the blast, the radioactive cloud had traveled northeast, covering distances of up to 350 kilometers. The fallout contaminated an area of between 800 and 20,000 square kilometers, depending on the threshold of contamination used for assessment. The region, later named the East Ural Radioactive Trace, or EURT, became one of the most severely affected areas of radioactive pollution in history. The dominant isotopes were cesium-137 and strontium-90, both with long half-lives and significant biological hazards. At least 22 villages lay within the contaminated zone. Their combined population, estimated at around 10,000 people, faced severe exposure risks. Evacuations began only after several days in some places and stretched over nearly 2 years for others. Many residents were unaware of the nature of the disaster or the invisible dangers surrounding them. Agricultural lands, forests, and waterways absorbed large quantities of radioactive materials, ensuring prolonged contamination. Measurements taken after the event indicated that areas spanning roughly 15 to 20,000 square kilometers contained strontium-90 levels exceeding 3.7 kilobecquerels per square meter. Thousands of emergency workers were deployed to contain the damage and assist with cleanup. Among approximately 10,500 workers assessed, external radiation doses averaged between 220 and 265 millisieverts, with some individuals receiving exposures approaching 950 millisieverts. The collective radiation dose accumulated between 1957 and 1960 is estimated to have reached about 7,300 person-sieverts. If the officially mapped traces are this large, could there be contamination beyond those limits, hidden lands once thought safe? Let's tell you the hidden details. Mapping the fallout. The East Ural radioactive trace emerged following the 1957 explosion at the Mayak Production Association. Radioactive fallout settled across a broad region northeast of the site, forming one of the largest mapped zones of contamination in the Soviet Union. The plume traveled roughly 300 to 350 kilometers within 10 to 11 hours of the blast. Along its path, It deposited long-lived radionuclides, especially strontium-90, creating a continuous belt of contamination that extended for scores of settlements. The affected zone encompassed more than 200 settlements and an estimated population of around 270,000 people. Evacuations were limited and delayed in many places due to secrecy and inadequate communication. Only about 10,200 people from the most highly exposed areas were formally relocated. Within the settlements nearest the blast zone, bone marrow equivalent doses averaged near 570 millisieverts, while many others received lower but still significant exposures. Assessing the full health impact remains difficult. Radiation-induced cancers cannot be distinguished individually from other causes. A Soviet-era 1992 study reported 8,015 deaths over 32 years in the extended region. In contrast, more conservative later analyses attribute around 50 to 200 excess cancer deaths specifically to the fallout. The ecological consequences are clear. Farmland, forests, and waterways absorbed large quantities of radioactive materials, and while some areas have been returned to use, significant zones remain unsafe. Natural processes like rainfall and soil migration have redistributed radionuclides, but the contamination legacy endures. If hidden contamination exists inside the forbidden zone, what about the waterways downstream? How many villages drank the fallout without knowing? A new discovery in the forbidden zone. For decades, the Mayak Production Association and its surrounding exclusion zones were shrouded in secrecy. The Soviet government maintained strict control over information concerning the 1957 explosion and its aftermath. Only recently have researchers begun to uncover a more complex picture of the environmental legacy left behind. Through the use of remote sensing, declassified satellite images, and detailed soil analyses, new investigations are revealing patterns of contamination and structural degradation that contradict long-standing official accounts of containment and cleanup. Archival materials combined with modern remote sensing techniques have allowed scientists to reconstruct the environmental evolution of the Mayak region with remarkable precision. Satellite photographs taken over several decades show subtle yet persistent anomalies in vegetation growth and surface coloration across sections of the East Ural radioactive trace. These irregularities align with areas of heightened radioactivity and suggest that contamination persisted beyond the officially delineated boundaries. Soil inventories from surrounding forests have provided additional confirmation, indicating that radioactive elements remain concentrated in organic layers and continue to migrate slowly through the ecosystem. One of the most striking revelations comes from a 2023 study that assessed long-term radionuclide retention in forest soils within parts of the EURT. The research estimated the presence of approximately 4.2 x 1014 becquerels of strontium-90 distributed through soil horizons. This finding implies that substantial quantities of radioactive material were neither fully contained nor adequately accounted for during previous cleanup operations. The persistence of such levels decades after the initial explosion raises questions about the effectiveness of waste management practices at Mayak and the extent of environmental monitoring conducted afterward. These new data have also brought attention to possible storage failure zones located within the broader exclusion area. Ground-penetrating radar and aerial imagery suggest that certain waste tanks and burial sites may have experienced structural weakening over time. Cracks, subsidence, and water infiltration likely allowed radionuclides to leach into nearby soil and groundwater. The pattern of contamination detected in forested regions corresponds closely to drainage pathways and low-lying areas where runoff accumulates, revealing a more intricate distribution of pollution than previously recognized. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond the local landscape. They challenge long-held assumptions about the amount of waste that escaped containment and about how radioactive materials interacted with the regional environment. Official Soviet and later Russian reports emphasize that the contamination was largely confined to the EURT corridor. However, the latest analyses imply that dispersal may have been wider and more uneven, shaped by hydrological and meteorological processes that were poorly understood at the time. The waterborne legacy isn't just about what we knew, and let's reveal how the Cold War's silence hid far more than just radiation, contaminated water, and forgotten villages. Long before the 1957 explosion at the Mayak Production Association, the Teka River had already become a silent conduit for radioactive waste. Beginning in the late 1940s, liquid effluents from nuclear processing operations were released directly into the river system. The waterway, stretching through dozens of rural settlements in the southern Urals, served as a vital lifeline for nearby communities that relied on it for drinking water, irrigation, and fishing. This dependence turned into a grave vulnerability as radionuclides began to accumulate in sediments and aquatic vegetation, gradually transforming the river into one of the most contaminated freshwater systems on Earth. The contamination was not an isolated episode, but a continuous process that unfolded over years of unchecked disposal. Between 1953 and 1960, residents of riverside villages received effective radiation doses ranging from 35 to 1,700 millisieverts due to exposure from earlier discharges. The intensity of radiation varied according to proximity to the Mayak complex and patterns of river flow. People who lived in settlements closer to the discharge points faced chronic internal and external exposure through water consumption, fishing, and agricultural activities that used contaminated irrigation. The radioactive materials most prevalent in the Tesha River system included strontium-90 and cesium-137, both of which bind strongly to soil particles and enter biological cycles through plants and animals. Once absorbed by crops or livestock, these isotopes accumulated within the food chain. Residents who consumed locally grown produce or meat unknowingly ingested radioactive substances that concentrated in bone and muscle tissue. As a result, radiation exposure did not end with the cessation of dumping, but continued through decades of ecological recycling. Dozens of villages along the river were severely affected, yet the response to their plight was fragmented and slow. Some communities were evacuated when contamination levels became undeniable, while others were left in place despite dangerous conditions. The selection process often depended more on administrative convenience than on scientific assessment. In certain cases, relocation orders arrived years after the highest exposure periods had already passed. Those who remained behind continued to use contaminated wells and fields, unaware of the cumulative damage to their health. The environmental degradation extended beyond human settlements. Radioactive particles settled into riverbanks and floodplains, infiltrating the soil and spreading during seasonal floods. Pastures where livestock grazed became secondary sources of contamination. Fish populations, once an important food source, accumulated isotopes in their tissues. Over time, the entire ecosystem of the Teka Basin reflected the imprint of sustained radioactive pollution. Forests and meadows bordering the river displayed changes in plant composition, and animal populations declined in areas with high contamination levels. Although scientific studies have since documented the magnitude of exposure, the social history of the affected villages remains largely unrecorded. Many were erased from maps as evacuations proceeded, and the region was transformed into a restricted zone. The memory of those who once lived along the Tesha River endures mainly through scattered testimonies and official records. The contaminated waters that once sustained them continue to carry traces of their forgotten existence. And yet, people stayed there, lived there, and there are lives still living under the shadow of Mayak. The Cold War cover-up and changing narratives. The explosion at the Mayak nuclear facility in 1957 unfolded within the shadowed framework of the Cold War, when secrecy defined every aspect of the Soviet nuclear program. The facility operated inside a closed city, inaccessible to outsiders and unknown even to most Soviet citizens. The government imposed strict information controls, forbidding independent investigations and silencing witnesses. Reports of illness or environmental damage were classified as state secrets, and official documents offered only vague references to an unspecified chemical accident. The people living near the site, unaware of the scale of the catastrophe, continued their daily lives amid invisible contamination. The origins of the disaster lay in the broader political and technological pressures of the post-war nuclear arms race. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union was determined to match the United States in nuclear capability. Within a few years, an enormous research and production effort was launched to create weapons-grade uranium and plutonium. The Mayak complex, constructed between 1945 and 1948, was the centerpiece of this effort. Built at great speed and under conditions of secrecy, it represented the intense drive for military parity rather than a concern for safety or sustainability. From its inception, the Mayak site suffered from fundamental design flaws. Engineers and planners operated with limited experience in nuclear safety. All 6 reactors at the plant used an open-cycle cooling system that discharged irradiated water directly into nearby Lake Kyshtym. This practice, intended as a quick solution for production efficiency, exposed both workers and the surrounding environment to continuous radioactive pollution. The absence of containment barriers and the disregard for environmental health reflected a systemic prioritization of production goals over human welfare. When the explosion occurred in 1957, the state's reaction mirrored the same indifference that had defined its planning. No immediate evacuation took place in nearby settlements, and residents were not informed about the source of the strange illnesses and deaths that soon followed. Radiation levels in the air and water were known to scientists at the facility, yet local populations were told only to avoid certain areas or to wash their vegetables before eating. Official statements minimized the severity of the event, framing it as an industrial accident rather than a nuclear catastrophe. One eyewitness later recalled that soldiers arrived without explanation, collecting soil samples and ordering families to leave their homes within hours, while others in nearby villages were left behind for months. For decades, full records of these evacuations remained hidden. Internal reports withheld maps of contamination, medical files of exposed patients, and data on the extent of environmental damage. Only after the gradual opening of archives and independent scientific reviews did the true scope of the disaster begin to emerge. Later epidemiological studies documented significantly higher rates of solid cancers and other chronic conditions among affected populations. The evolving narrative of Mayak, once buried under layers of official denial, now stands as a stark reminder of how secrecy and speed in the pursuit of power can distort both science and humanity. What are current remediation efforts doing? Are they enough? And what about what we haven't addressed yet? The people of the zone. The people who lived within the East Ural radioactive trace carried the weight of an invisible burden that few outside the region could comprehend. When the explosion at Mayak spread its plume of radioactive material across hundreds of kilometers, it created not only a contaminated landscape, but a generation defined by exposure and silence. Those who remained within the affected zone lived through decades of secrecy, isolation, and slow recognition of the disaster's human cost. Scientific research conducted long after the event has revealed the scope of health effects among the exposed population. A long-term epidemiological study known as the East Ural Radioactive Trace Cohort examined approximately 2,400 individuals who lived within the contaminated area. The findings demonstrated a statistically significant increase in both solid cancer incidence and cancer-related mortality. The data confirmed what many local families had long suspected, that their persistent illnesses were not isolated tragedies, but symptoms of a shared environmental catastrophe. Exposure levels varied dramatically depending on proximity to the blast and on whether evacuation occurred. Some of the evacuated communities near the epicenter received average red bone marrow doses of about 520 millisieverts, an exposure level far exceeding typical occupational limits. Others, particularly in remote villages, remained for years without relocation. In these areas, residents continued to farm, draw water from contaminated wells, and consume food grown in radioactive soil. Children played on the banks of rivers that carried invisible isotopes, and livestock grazed in pastures where radionuclides lingered in grass and sediment. Daily life in these settlements was marked by a sense of normality shadowed by unexplained illness. People experienced fatigue, skin lesions, and recurring infections, yet they were often told that these ailments were unrelated to radiation. Medical records were incomplete or classified, and those seeking treatment in nearby towns faced both bureaucratic obstacles and social stigma. The official silence surrounding the disaster turned suffering into a private matter, leaving communities to navigate their losses alone. As the decades passed, the social consequences of the disaster deepened. Entire villages disappeared from maps, their names erased when residents were forced to relocate. Those who stayed behind were often labeled contaminated, a mark that followed them through generations. Marriages were discouraged between families from the affected zone and outsiders, and survivors spoke of being treated as if they carried a contagious disease. The radiological stigma became as persistent as the contamination itself. Today, many of the once inhabited settlements remain restricted zones. Crumbling houses in overgrown fields stand as monuments to lives uprooted by secrecy and neglect. For some residents, the trauma lies not only in the physical effects of radiation, but in the loss of identity that followed displacement. The legacy of Mayak continues to shape memory, culture, and health in the region. Beneath the surface of official acknowledgement, the story of those who lived in the shadow endures as a quiet testimony to endurance, loss, and the enduring cost of concealment. If the map of the disaster is wrong, then our understanding of its victims, its scope may be far larger than we've ever admitted. What's being done and what lies ahead? Efforts to repair the environmental and human damage left by the Mayak disaster have unfolded slowly and unevenly across the decades. After the 1957 explosion, Soviet authorities initiated a series of remediation actions designed to limit further radioactive spread and to stabilize the region. These measures intensified after a later incident in 1967, when strong winds carried radioactive dust from the dried bed of Lake Karachay into surrounding territories. The government began large-scale containment operations, filling sections of the lake with concrete and soil to prevent additional dispersal of contaminated sediment. Other early actions focused on controlling the immediate sources of exposure. Deep in Russia's long-restricted Ural region, scientists have uncovered startling new evidence that challenges decades of official accounts about the 1957 Kyshtym disaster. Using advanced satellite imaging and soil analysis, researchers have detected hidden contamination and possible storage failures within the Mayak site. What they found beneath the forests may rewrite the history of nuclear secrecy forever. The Hidden Blast. On 29 September 1957, a catastrophic explosion shook the Mayak Production Association, one of the Soviet Union's most secret nuclear facilities. The accident occurred in a storage tank containing between 70 and 80 tons of liquid radioactive waste. A cooling system installed to prevent overheating had failed the previous year and was never repaired. As the contents of the tank heated, the liquid began to evaporate, leaving behind a dense mixture of nitrates and acetates. When this residue reached critical temperatures, a powerful chemical explosion erupted, comparable to the detonation of 70 to 100 tons of TNT. The blast hurled a massive concrete lid weighing about 160 tons into the air. The explosion released approximately 20 megacuries, equal to about 740 petabecquerels of radioactive materials. Around 90% of this release settled near the site, contaminating the immediate area and intensifying pollution in the Teka River system. The remaining fraction formed a radioactive cloud that drifted for many kilometers. This airborne plume, carrying roughly 2 megacuries of radionuclides, spread contamination across a vast swath of the southern Urals. The Mayak site had already been burdened by extensive radioactive waste disposal practices before the disaster. The Teka River had received nearly 2.75 megacuries of intentionally released waste, and Lake Karachay had absorbed an even greater burden, amounting to about 120 megacuries. The 1957 explosion transformed these already hazardous areas into zones of acute contamination, amplifying the long-term environmental and health consequences. Within 10 to 11 hours after the blast, the radioactive cloud had traveled northeast, covering distances of up to 350 kilometers. The fallout contaminated an area of between 800 and 20,000 square kilometers, depending on the threshold of contamination used for assessment. The region, later named the East Ural Radioactive Trace, or EURT, became one of the most severely affected areas of radioactive pollution in history. The dominant isotopes were cesium-137 and